to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoy the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. My guest this week is once again Jonathan Bowman-Perks. Jonathan was a guest of mine on episode 24 way back when I was fairly early on in the podcast, and now with more than 100 episodes, I thought it was a great opportunity to get him back. Why? Because he and I do very similar things in many ways. We both do coaching work and leadership development work. We both host a podcast. He's been going a lot longer than me with his Inspiring Leadership podcast. And because we've got similar backgrounds, but different backgrounds in the same breath. So he was in the Army. He then went from the Army to PwC, to professional services, then from there to IBM, then from there to a senior job in Penna. And then he set up his own business doing what he does now. And we've got, therefore, a raft of perspectives that are potentially useful to leaders in all walks of life. And that's what we thought we'd talk about. We've done our kind of personal story side. I was on his podcast as well a while back. And he obviously did that on mine. So this one is much more us talking about stuff that we're hearing from other people. So things that we're hearing from leaders, challenges that are out there, and our perspectives on what we think about some of those challenges and where they might go. I hope you find it interesting. We certainly enjoyed the conversation and could have gone on probably for quite a lot longer. That's it for now, and I really hope you enjoy the session. Off we go. Hey, Jonathan, welcome back. You're the first guest I've had for the second time on my podcast, and I've done that because when we spoke last time, you were my episode 24, and you were already approaching your 300th episode. So clearly a ton of more podcasts than I've got. And I haven't caught you up because you've carried on recording at the same rate as me, depressingly. But we have both got a wealth of experience now. I mean, I'm obviously north of 100 just, which is great. And I think in the 18 months since we spoke, it's been a really interesting journey looking at the world. And I think some of the challenges that are facing leaders in all sorts of walks of life, whether it's political, whether it's industrial, private sector, public sector, it doesn't really matter. I think some of these things are really, really big challenges for them now. And therefore, it's why I thought it was worth us having another conversation. And I'm really delighted that you're back to do that. So we may just have a few tips that are useful to them. What do you think?
Well, it's lovely to be back, Bob. And I've been looking back and listening to your own podcast. You've had some fabulous guests, really interesting topics. And I've really enjoyed your stories. You've packed in an awful lot into your life, and all that flying, but also all that experience with a range of very interesting leaders, good and bad, egotists and humble leaders. And so, yeah, I think if we can help those listening with the accumulation of, I suppose, between us about 500 different guests, and their views and our own experiences, I think it might be useful, some useful practical tips that they can take from today, I hope.
Yeah, I agree. And hence the reason for doing it, because I think there are some really common themes that I think we're both picking up, I'm sure. And some of those are sort of really big stuff from the geopolitical bits, and maybe we'll come to some of that downstream. But some of it is certainly internal to organizations. I mean, the first one of those that I thought was worth having a discussion around really is this whole intergenerational working. It started out for me with some of the work I do at Deloitte University, for example, where people were talking about working with Gen Z. And I don't think it is just about working with Gen Z. I think it is about intergenerational working. I'm pretty convinced that when I started in the workplace, and you will be in a similar place, there are probably lots of people in the generations ahead of us who are going, oh, they're not like we were. And so there's that kind of criticism that comes. But they are definitely facing some, I think the leaders in organizations are facing some challenges in how they deal with this in the current generation. And I think there are some good reasons for that. COVID's played a big part. in terms of start of some people in the workplace and the mindset they've got. I think the value set's different anyway. I think some of the obvious big challenges in the world around climate and so on are shaping the thinking of youngsters. Social media clearly is shaping the thinking of youngsters. Are you seeing the same thing? I mean, what are you kind of hearing?
Yeah, I think particularly Gen Zs do get the criticism, lazy, entitled, wanting rapid promotion without the graft. But I think back to my grandmother who was complaining about my generation, and I got a couple of quotes from leaders here, which you might notice them. I see no hope of the future of our people if they're dependent on frivolous youth of today, for certainly all youth are reckless beyond words. When I was young, we were taught to be discreet and respectful of elders, but the present youth are exceedingly disrespectful and impatient of restraint. And somebody else, our youth now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders, and they love to chatter instead of exercise. Children are now tyrants, not servants of their household. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. That was Hesiod in the 8th century, the first one, and Socrates giving the second one. That it's always been there with us, this
Yeah.
criticism of the younger generation or another generation. And there was one of my leaders was going on about the younger generation. And I said, "You're a grandfather, aren't you?" And he went, "Yeah, I am." I said, "What's your grandson like?" "Oh, no, he's great. I mean, he's lovely. He's thoughtful, he's kind." And I said, "Do you not see there might be a little bit of a, them and us?" So that we've got to be careful of that. But we do need to, I'm certain you're right, Bob. We need to think about different generations look at things in different ways. And with 4 married children, all in their 30s, and 4 grandchildren, I can see different generations.
I think there's also, interestingly, I facilitated a course a while ago where one of the participants, and it was a Deloitte University course, it was a senior manager milestone. One of the participants was a 26-year-old senior manager who was what the UK Deloitte is calling a bright start. So joined straight from school, didn't go to university, and had obviously done very well, clearly was very, very diligent, worked very hard, and was one of, without a doubt, one of the leading lights in that particular group. She was very active contributor, had lots of great thoughts and really good kind of topics to raise and challenges to bring and so on. And she was very interesting on this whole topic because, of course, she is Gen Z herself, and she found it very interesting and challenging working with her own age group who had not joined straight from school, but had actually gone through university, and as often the case these days, had actually done a gap year before university, then done a master's after university, and then come into the world of work. So they were probably 2 years into Deloitte. She'd been there for better part of 8. And she was really quite critical because she saw all the things that I think people are criticizing them for in her own kind of age group, and some of that is the sort of nature nurture debate, isn't it? I think where if you've grown up with an organization and a group of people and seen that work ethic and seen the way they're working versus coming into the world of work and going, this is the way it should be. And I don't know, I have an interesting angle on this, I think, around hybrid, because I do think there's some real challenges around, hybrid working is great if you've had the basis where you're actually you've got the grounding, you've done worked in an environment where you've developed the team, you understand what goes on, you've had all those sort of sub meeting conversations, the stuff at the water cooler, the stuff by the coffee machine, the kind of sit by the side of the desk and have a bit of counselling and guidance and those sorts of things, which I think that is largely absent from a lot of people at the moment, and that has got to be generating some challenges.
Yeah, exactly right on the hybrid and the where are people going to cut their teeth? So my wife, Lee, runs a charity. She's the CEO of a charity for the victims of violence against women and girls, the Inspiring Leadership Foundation. And she has a number of young people who come and work for her. And they are really struggling to get work experience or get started on the ladder, particularly as we'll come on to later, AI, which before they'd use some graduates or some interns to gather some research or look some stuff up for them. They don't need to now. They go straight onto Perplexity or ChatGPT-4 and they get the information themselves. So they don't need. So 40% of those jobs have gone for the people who are starting out. So how do you get your first experience? And how do these people cut their teeth? Like the young manager you talk about who got 8 years experience. These guys come in, and there is a level of they have had helicopter parents in some cases in the higher paid entrants who've always told them that they're wonderful, darling, and you're clever, and here's a medal for coming last, and all this kind of stuff for attending the sports day, and they suddenly can't understand where they get a bit of kickback or they get a bit of harsh feedback, and they crumble because they've not had setbacks and disappointments.
Yeah, I think the competitive thing is really interesting, isn't it? With schools in particular. I mean, I was a governor at Christ Hospital where I went to school for 8 years, finished a couple of years ago, and we used to have quite robust conversations about this. You know, that life is a competition, and therefore turning around and bringing people up in a world where you say, well, no, we shouldn't have that. Everyone should get rewarded. And there's a bit of me that totally agrees with that. I think you've got to be careful. You don't want to make it completely elitist and you only if it's only first that counts. But at the same time, you have to recognize that is the way the world works. And I think if you don't bring that up into young people, it's going to be a challenge. I mean, amusingly, I remember watching it's Meet the Parents and Meet the Fockers, isn't it? The two stories, of comedy movies with Robert De Niro and Ben Stiller and co. Where there's Robert De Niro saying to Ben Stiller, "I didn't know they did ribbons for ninth place, Greg." And it is a thing. It definitely is a thing. And I think the more people get a sense early on that actually they're going to have to fight for their places and they're going to have to fight for opportunities. And you mentioned, I mean, we'll probably talk more about AI in a bit, but I think the advent and growth of AI is going to make this much, much more difficult because there are going to be a lot less opportunities that people have to actively compete for. And you see it now. I mean, you talk about, I remember listening to someone recently, it was in the arts actually, where they're talking about a place becoming vacant in one of the major symphony orchestras. It was the New York Symphony Orchestra, I think. And there were 2,000 applicants for the one place. And that obviously is a really specialist skill, isn't it? It's not something that loads of people are able to turn around and go, yeah, I've got to have a go at that. If you're looking for someone playing at that level, you obviously need to have a huge amount of basic skill before you even put your application in. Whereas an awful lot of corporate roles, you're probably going to have 10 times that number of applicants potentially, because there will be people who genuinely do think they've got a shot at it.
Yeah, it is a very interesting one. This you mentioned the life is competitive, and in the psychometrics, which I'm fascinated by, and I do a lot, as you probably have seen a lot over your years. My wife and I laughed at one of the ones that we'd done and that we use with clients, and it turned out that I was both competitive and comparative, and she was comparative. So this comes out in when we go and train in our gym. We turn the garage into a gym. We have a personal trainer comes, and I'll go in there, and Keegan is built like a god. He's from South Africa, and he's just phenomenally strong. And so I'll go all out, and my wife will come and do it. But she'll see me training, and then if I'm competitive, it'll switch her off. She'll go, "Forget it. I'm not playing. No, 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 no. I know you'll try and do two more than me in everything I do. No, and I'll leave you two to it." Which we laugh about it, but I think that competitive and comparative, it was part of what you and I had in the military. And certainly to get to the level you got as a pilot, your selection process is so brutal. And it's all the time, every state, every day you're being compared, ranked, you're in competition with people. And we know what that's like, but it is brutal. And it's not in every walk of life, and people sometimes literally violently react to that and find it quite a toxic culture. We're quite used to it. We go, this is normal. But I think AI will make far less jobs, and EQ will become much more important to people. And I think a lot of people now come with their ticket of, I'm on the spectrum of all these different things here, from ADHD to dyslexia to dyscalculia and all that. No, I have dyslexia and dyscalculia, so I'm taking the piss out of myself. But this long list of, I have these exemptions and can I have another hour on my exam for it. But actually, it's quite a problem, and you need people who can get on with other humans and can read their own emotions, manage their own emotions. not claim they need exemption because they've had a bad day at work and they've got a mental health issue and can they go home now? Um, this is it's a harder environment, I think, going forward.
I agree, and I think that the staying power bit is another one for me. And I don't mean in terms of, well, possibly I do mean two parts to this. One is, many jobs out there. It's not about 9 to 5. It's about get the job done. And and obviously, and I certainly advocate to people all the time. Look, if you're in a world where you're always working ridiculously long hours, there's something wrong and you need to fix it. And if you yourself are doing that, you're setting the wrong example of the people working for you. But there will be occasions, and the analogy I often use to people is, if you imagine, an old kind of gas lamp or a paraffin lamp or whatever, if you want the flame to burn brighter, you turn it up and it burns brighter, but you burn more gas or you burn more paraffin or whatever it is that you're actually using with that. And there's only a certain amount of time that you can burn it at 100%, maybe even turn it up so it's going to burn it out ultimately at about 120%. But if you do that, it will burn out. You need to be in a position where you're having a steady maintenance of renewable fuel coming into that for your own personal life as well. And then turn the wick up when you need to, turn it back down when you don't need to. Don't keep running at a very, very sort of high temperature on the thing. And I think there are too many people who do that just in the day to day. But I think the other thing that worries me a little bit about this intergenerational working thing is there seems to be a theme developing. You said it right at the beginning. I want to be promoted really quickly, but actually I don't really want to do all the work that others have done in the past to get me there. And there's this is the first of my 15 careers I'm going to have, being a bit flippant. And I'm going to move from this to this to this to this. Well, that might work, but I'm going to be really interested, if I had a crystal ball or if I live long enough to see it in 15 or 20 years time, to see how that has worked out for people. Because I do think there is obviously experience is enormously important, and building a basis of experience that gives you the credibility that takes you to the next thing, because you've got credibility doing whatever you did before. I mean, one of the reasons that I've got plenty of credibility doing the stuff I do now is because I spent 34 years doing what I did in the military. Similarly for you, you spent a long time in the army, then you built another whole second career doing what you do now. And and that gives you that credibility. If you stick at stuff for 2 or 3 years, it is going to be more challenging, I think, to really be credible.
Yeah, and that brings on another point, back to when you were you work now with Deloitte in your own right, but when you were full time with Deloitte, um, one of my friend's sons was working in Deloitte, and the sort of equity partners said, look, if you stay in, this long time career, you could do what I do. And he went, I'm not sure I want to work as hard as you're working. Yes, you earn £1 million, but actually, I want life experiences. I can't afford the kind of house that you have. My generation won't be able to afford that. But what I am going to do is have a lot of experiences, and actually, I think on average, by the age of 34, they think they've had about 6 or 7 different jobs. That generation of my children who are now in their 30s. And they don't see it like you and I did. I mean, I did 20 years, you did 34 in one organization. And they go, why would you do that? And I'm not sure I want to be you.
Mm-hmm.
So this is quite a problem for that staying power in, whether it's Deloitte or any other the bigger firms, where they need people who've accumulated, particularly the military. I mean, the military's, got a real problem as it tries to retain people. You can't suddenly pluck someone out and come on, be an air vice marshal.
Yeah.
What were you doing yesterday?
Lateral hire is a challenge.
Yeah, come and be an air vice marshal. They expect people to work all their way from the bottom, whereas retention is really quite a problem. I'm not sure what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I think that there's and certain careers obviously have a much bigger challenge than others in terms of that ability to lateral hire, because lateral hire is fine. It works really well for an awful lot of organizations where you're bringing different experience in and so on. And for sure, that is helpful. I tend to agree with you completely that people are looking upwards now and having a different perspective about, do I want to do what you do? You go back to the Deloitte example. Well, one of the questions we regularly ask directors, actually on the director milestone course, is, we do a little icebreaker thing right at the beginning, and we ask a series of questions and ask them if if the sort of answer is positive or it applies to them, step into this particular box. And one of the questions we tend to ask is, do you want to be a partner? Who knows they want to be a partner? And it's really very interesting when you've got three other partners, typically in the room as facilitators, along with me as an external facilitator, that probably on average 50, maybe 60% will step into that box. And there are increasingly quite a lot who do not. And then you kind of interrogate that a little bit. And a lot of them, exactly as you said, are kind of going, well, no, do you know what? It doesn't really fit with my work-life balance kind of approach. And I look at the way this is, and I just don't really see it as being something I want to do. Some of them are a bit more ambivalent. I'm keeping my options open and so on and so forth. But, I think it's right. I think that is a different world. And I think, again, for leaders, that presents a different challenge, because how are you growing the people in your succession planning? I mean, one of the great weaknesses I've seen in some of the roles I've been in, particularly in the military, actually, is a kind of lack of thought around succession planning and growth, and not just in the military. I mean, actually, when I was employed by Deloitte, I think that was a weakness in a number of people, where they didn't think about, when I'm not there anymore, what are we going to do? I've spent, he's a good friend of mine, and I won't name him, but there's a guy who retired as a partner, who had spent 26 years as a partner, had clearly built enormously good, strong relationships with his particular industry segment. And then when he left. And you kind of go, all those relationships, all that time and effort that you've put into doing that, how is that carried on by the firm for the greater good of the firm's benefit, and leverage that rather than starting again? And that is going to be made more challenging by people actually saying, well, I'm just going to step away anyway. I'm not interested in growing up into your role and continuing on. So yeah, it's definitely a factor.
Yeah, it is interesting. And you touch on the work-life balance, which is so important to this generation, Gen
Rightly
Z.
so.
And the reason it's so important is they look to our generation, and two of my guests, Neil Basu, who was the head of counterterrorism, Queen's Police Medal, and a very fine officer. His book, Turmoil, I discussed with him on the podcast. And then Al Khan's, the veterans minister, who served in special forces. Neil said, I would give anything for 5 minutes more to my 19-year-old son, who I'm estranged from my first of three marriages, because I gave my all to Crown and Country. Manchester Arena bomb, the Niall Tusk incident with the guy at the Fishmongers Hall, things like this. The flashbacks come back to him from all that time and effort to keep the country safe. He admitted he was a workaholic. He was giving so much to the job. And then take Al, Royal Marine, soldier who became an officer and then on to a parliamentarian. He said, I still regret now, my ex-wife and I look at the 21-year-old daughter, and I really only probably spent 2 years of her life with her in 21 years,
Yeah.
because he was constantly on 6-month tours in Afghanistan or Iraq. I mean, that war in Afghanistan and Iraq, which you took part in, that's 20 years. There's no other war that length of time. And I don't think people have realized that when you do some of these very high-powered, full-on, quite macho, high-profile, deeply respected jobs, there is a cost that comes with it.
Oh, definitely. I mean, so one of my podcast guests in that space was Liz McConaughey, who wrote the Chinook Crew Chick book. She is an outstandingly interesting, very, very lovely Northern Irish lady, who has a great sense of humor. She's fully vibrant, charismatic. You talk to her, on a Zoom call, and you go, how on earth did you end up in a position where she ultimately tried to take her own life, and obviously didn't succeed, fortunately, and is now very active as a speaker. She's an ambassador for combat stress and those sorts of things. She did 10 tours in Afghanistan and 2 tours in Iraq. And of course, that toll is huge. It can't be anything else. And I think we look backwards. We tend to be looking backwards at Second World War, First World War, and with rightly with admiration for what they did and what they suffered and what they gave for us and for your tomorrow, we gave our today and all that. But the reality is there's a lot of that around today as well. And that is challenging. And I think in the business world, it's the same. I think that you may not be dealing with the life and death stuff, but people are absolutely in that workaholic mode. They drive themselves too hard. They sometimes expect too much from the people that work for them, and don't necessarily sort of roll their sleeves up and get stuck in themselves. I mean, I'm a huge believer in leading by example is absolutely key. That doesn't mean you're absolutely the one taking all the risks and at the front every time, but it means I again, one of the things I tend to say to people is you've got to think about this. It's like a bank account. If you, when you work with your team, every time you work with your team and you're pulling a late night, whatever it is, or you're having to do something out of the ordinary and you're working with them doing it, you're putting money in the bank account, you're making an investment. Then when you can't do it for some reason, you're actually able to take some money out of the bank account. If you never put any money in the bank account, then there's no money to take out, and it's not something you can go overdrawn on. They'll just lose respect for you instantly if you're if you're in that position. And I think it's an important consideration in terms of showing the right path yourself. So you're demonstrating, kind of walk the walk as well as talk the talk. So I think there is a lot of that. I always laugh at people who send emails out that on the bottom of the email it says, "I work strange hours. Please don't feel the need to reply in this time, etc., etc." And there's a place for that. I'm not decrying it as a practice per se. But the point I make to leaders a lot of the time is just think about the fact that the signaling that you are giving to people. So if you're sending an email to someone that arrives at 11 o'clock at night, in your team, they are going to know, right, you're sending that, and therefore you may or may not be expecting a response straight away, but that's the message you're sending is that's what you kind of need to do to be like me. And if they do want to be a bit like you and they actually still want to get promoted and all the rest of it, that's creating a culture that perhaps you don't want to create. And I'm not necessarily suggesting people do it deliberately. I think it's accidental. People are busy. They do work strange hours and all the rest of it. But these days there are tools that will help you not do that. You can schedule email sends and all those sorts of things that will potentially make life a bit easier. And I just think people need to think a bit harder about it, to be honest.
You are so right. That's triggered a number of thoughts there, Bob. The first one is, why are they working at 11 o'clock? Or, I mean, bless her, my wife, with the lead up to this charity event, she isn't paid as the CEO. She's also a podcaster and a facilitator and a coach, but she does her work for the charity for free. But she is so passionate about it. She might be working until 1:30 in the morning on sending notes out. Now, sending a note out at 1:30 in the morning, not a good message, but she does it because she wants to make things happen. She wants to change the situation with the victims of violence, women and girls, and give them another chance in life. But I'm drawn to the book by Bonnie Ware. I don't know if you came across it, the top 5 regrets of the dying. It's an interesting book. She had a bit of a dysfunctional life and tried various things and drugs, but she ended up working with palliative care. She was palliative care nurse to those at the end of their life. And in the discussion she had with them at the end of their life, what regrets did they have? And she filtered it down to 5. I've just got them here. I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not what others expected of me. That was the first one. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. The second one. I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings, the third. I wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends, is the fourth. And I wish I'd let myself be happier.
Yeah.
Powerful, isn't it? Powerful.
Yeah, it is very powerful and very, very true as well. Yeah, I mean, there's a joke one that goes with that as well, isn't there? Where there's very, very few people in there, lying on their deathbed who turn around and say they wish they'd worked harder. I think it's one of those things. Interestingly for me, I was having this conversation just yesterday with someone about, we're both similar age and we're in our 60s. We're sitting there, doing this kind of stuff and reflecting on what we do and sharing some of the experience and knowledge we've got. And people then say, well, are you going to retire? And I said, well, yeah, at some point, I suppose. But, to be perfectly honest, I mean, I do want to keep my brain active and I keep doing what I want to do. But I know I'm guilty. I don't just drink my own Kool-Aid some of the time. I know that I'm guilty of, doing too much some of the time, not spending enough time, family time, etc. And it is just one of those things that I think you need to have a bit of a check on yourself and make sure you're thinking about it. And I think actually going back to right where we started with the intergenerational working thing, I think one of the things that youngsters are very much better at than our generation is exactly that. They are being much more robust about, no, I'm sorry, I'm not working till 8 o'clock at night, and I'm not going to go and do what you want me to do in terms of ridiculous schedules and and all the rest of it, because that's just not my thing. Now, I think there's a balance, because I think there are times in any role where actually, in order to make the role successful, you do need to accept that you're going to have to go above and beyond a bit, and you can't be totally black and white about it. But I think one of the good things, and one of the things I think leaders should be harnessing from that younger generation, is exactly this. How do we turn around and think about our own working practices to do what we need to do to be profitable and effective and so on and so forth, without necessarily burning the people out, treating them like they're expendable commodities, etc. Which again, some organizations are much better at than others, and that's a challenge.
Well, quickly add, I'm not paid by Deloitte to say this, but Deloitte have done a fabulous job just recently where they've introduced paternity leave. And my son-in-law, who my daughter and son-in-law have got a 9-week-old baby, he has benefited from this new policy in Deloitte where he's been able to take up to 6 months to be a father with his daughter. And it's made a huge difference. Wasn't there for our generation at all. And in fact, both daughters, Harriet and Bryony, are each taking a year maternity leave from their busy jobs to be with their little daughters. And it's special time. And the fact that their husbands can be there at times to take on this new role when they're new parents is really impressive. So well done, Deloitte, and other firms which realize it matters to them, this work-life balance. And also, just one other thing, and I'll pass it back to you, Bob, is I get to coach some of the sons and daughters of the CEOs that I coach. It's in sort of conversations. It's what worries them. And sometimes I'll spend time with them. We'll go for a walk together. I do walking meetings, and I did one a couple of days ago along the canal here in Lincolnshire. Beautiful sunny day. And he said, this has been incredibly useful because as a 30-year-old, I've really had a crisis of purpose. What is my life about? I didn't want to do what my father did. I didn't want to follow him, not because his father is a very inspiring leader, but he said I just want to do something different. So I wasn't just seen as following my dad and just benefiting from his success, but actually, I'm not sure I know what I want to do in life. So we're spending quite a bit of time on what gives his life meaning, purpose, why he does what he does, what are his values, and how does he want to live his life? What is his legacy? So I think in the intergenerational gap, I think the older generations can be helpful as mentors and as coaches to help them work out what gives their life meaning and purpose and talk about their own mistakes and lessons. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think purpose is, back to that, do I want to retire thing? A huge part of not retiring for me is about actually saying, well, do you know what? It's important to have something to get out of bed in the morning for, and be, content with the mirror, the reflection in the mirror looking back at you. And I think that for me is fundamentally one of the two criteria I've always had through my entire working life, military or beyond. The other one being that I wanted to enjoy what I'm doing. And if, I tend to say to people a lot, if you're not enjoying what you're doing, you need to find a way to change it. And that, there are most big organizations now, there are lots of opportunities for doing different things within that organization. And if that ultimately isn't going to work, then you need to think about, long and hard about whether you jump into another organization. Because, if you're getting to our age and you're looking backwards and going, do you know what? I really didn't enjoy what I did with my life. That's a real shame.
Mm.
And so that, yeah, I totally agree. I think that purpose thing's so important. And interestingly, on your parental leave point, I was going to loop it into the hybrid working conversation a little bit, because I think, again, it's a bit binary in the world that we look at the moment. If I know, got friends and people I've worked with as well in the financial services world who post COVID were probably the fastest to turn around and go, right, everyone back in the office, at least a number of days a week, if not all the days of the week. And obviously, lots of people threw their arms up in horror and went, whoa, 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 hang on a minute. I'm quite happy doing what I'm doing now. I can be just as effective working from home. And I think for people like us who's sitting in the rooms we're in at the minute, where you've got a nice space where you can actually operate and function and do your work properly from home, then that's really straightforward. If you're in shared accommodation, you've got all sorts of issues with space, with internet bandwidth, with confidentiality, if you're dealing with sensitive information, all those kind of things that present some challenges. But at the same time, it's also, from a lifestyle point of view, generally really nice for people. And in the COVID world, of course, you had lots of people who started work from home who never ever got used to paying to get on a train or drive or whatever it is they're going to do to go to work, plus then obviously having lunch and having coffee and whatever else they're going to do out of their own salary. So they're then actually in a position, well, actually, you want me to come to the office, but this is quite an expensive proposition for me. So that's the one end of the challenge, that I think is there. And so if I look at the financial services world versus certainly Deloitte in the professional services world, said, actually, you don't need to come back to the office. We're downsizing the amount of space we've got, so you can't have everybody in the office all the time if you wanted to anyway. Clients don't necessarily want people from consultancies on their premises for exactly the same reason, because they've downsized their space. So there is more of a drive to say, unless you really need to be in the office, don't be. But that has consequences along the lines we were talking about earlier on, that I think it leads you into a space where, how do you build team ethos, build kind of team connectivity, just your personal skill set. I mean, I learned when I was, a youngster in the services, it's a different world, but the same thing. Learn an awful lot just from the crew room conversation, sat down with someone who's been there around, for a lot longer than you have, and chit chatting away about this, that, and the other. And I think the same when I joined Deloitte. The amount of stuff I learned at Deloitte, just because somebody said, "Hey, I'm doing this particular thing at the moment. Do you want to come and look over my shoulder and see what I'm doing?" If you're at home, you're not going to get any of that. So I think it's too binary in the minds of too many people at the minute. I think it's either, right, no, you need to be in the office because then we can prove you're productive, and we know that you're going to be doing what you're doing, and we can monitor how much time you're spending. Versus at the other end of the scale, actually, what are you losing by doing the stuff you're doing at home? And so I don't know what your thoughts are, but I guess you're seeing this and hearing this quite a lot from some of the people you work with.
Yeah, the whole topic of hybrid working is very interesting. And before the pandemic hit, I had a guest, Larry English, who'd written a book called Office Optional. And Larry has about 1,500 employees, consultancy in India and America. And they had no offices. Now, in those days before COVID-19, that was big. And but what he did was 3 times a year, he invited everybody from all over the world to come to one big venue, almost like an aircraft hangar, with their partners, and they had a social. They even had bands that got together. They had meetings. They had, lots of workshopping going on. And that was very successful, highly successful. But they never had offices. But when, as a consultancy, they needed to work with a client on something, they'd be at the client site and they'd use, obviously, offices there. And they would bring new team members onto client site to learn and be in, workshopping and things like that. Or they might hire a room just for a particular point. So I think he was very interesting about that and this more virtual landscape. But I think you're right. When I was with any of my CEOs, to a man or woman, they all wanted to be back to almost like 5 days a week. I want to see them. I can't trust them. They're not there. Well, they're bloody watching Neighbours or Home and Away or something from their childhood that people aren't watching anymore anyway, because they're so out of touch with what people do watch, or gaming until the early hours of the morning. And yeah, sure enough, I know people who are software engineers who'll do the work they need to do at home in 3 hours, and then they'll game the rest of the time. Well, if they get the work done, that's fine. But I'm just not sure how much value they're getting from being in that firm and whether that firm's getting the best out of that person. But that's what suits them, and being in their pajamas all day long is great if you're a tech geek. But I do think some kind of compromise where you are coming together for a reason, not just, oh, we'll come in on a Tuesday. So they come in on Tuesday and no one else is there. And so they wander around an empty office and they go, what is the point of this? I've paid for all my travel to come in. I've lost 3 hours of the day through commuting, and I just, no one's around. So it is a problem. And also, I think you've lost that, as you described, looking over that person's shoulder. You've lost that kind of apprenticeship and learning from watching and observing and seeing others. And new joiners who've never been in an office really miss that, really miss that. And it's a bow wave of a problem which is going to come and hit people. But the answer isn't just go back 5 days a week. That's not the answer.
No, I agree with that. And I think the new joiners thing is interesting because, of course, you don't know what you don't know. So if you've never done it, you don't really miss it because you don't know what you'd have got from it. And I think just telling people from a senior leadership point of view, you will get a lot from this, doesn't necessarily work. There has to be some way of bringing it in. And I agree with you that just going into the office to go and sit there and do your emails, you must be joking. I mean, I can do that perfectly well from home and probably more effectively from home with less distractions and so on potentially. So no, I think it's one of those interesting areas. But to your tech point, I mean, years ago, amusing story. I was working on the when I was still on the Jaguar, and we were doing the Jaguar upgrade, big upgrade to the airplane. We were working with what was then the Defense Research Agency, and there was a guy who was part of that team, who was a software engineer, who was a genius. I mean, no question, And we regularly would say to him, "Why don't you go and work for Microsoft or something? I mean, clearly you could probably earn 10 times the money." He was a civil servant working in DRA. And he loved the fact because he could sit there with 3 keyboards, 3 screens, doing stuff, with a complexity that I could only dream of. And he just loved the fact that at the same time, he could be eating a slice of pizza and sat there in his tracksuit and nobody cared about any of that kind of stuff. Now, I think the Microsofts and Googles have moved into that kind of space as well. So then that presents a more challenging environment. But you're right about all of that. I mean, I think it brings another interesting point on this whole behavior, dress, appearance, mannerisms, so on and so forth. I mean, maybe links back to the multi-generational point a little bit. That I think there is a danger that people of our generation walk around on eggshells somewhat with, we don't want to say the wrong thing to people about and use words that are no longer appropriate. I think there's a challenge from some of the younger generation that say, well, actually, I just want to wear what I want. I want to be my authentic self and so on and so forth, which I think is fine as long as you're compliant with the firm's policies and the firm's policies are kind of coherent and so on. However, and it's a big however, the point I tend to make to people is you have to recognize that we live in a world that is judgmental and people will judge you. So if you want to do, whatever you want to do, you want to turn up to work in shorts and a t-shirt, or you want to, have a tattoo on your forehead or whatever it happens to be, that might be absolutely fine for you, and you can perfectly well argue that case, but you have to recognize that people will form a view about you. And as we well know, people form views of you before you've even opened your mouth. If they've never met you, they're going to form a judgment of you in seconds, and you've then got work to do to change that judgment. And so you want it to be as favorable as it can be for whatever you're doing, and you just need to be mindful of that, I think.
Yeah, and I think from what you said, there's two other themes, which one is the challenge of relationship building, and the second one is the unexpected benefits of human connection. I think on the first one, I think of Seamus Smith, one of the CEOs, and he said the inability for him and the team to come together face to face was one of the big stress points, and it's really critical. And I went to do an offsite with a German team earlier this week in Frankfurt. and we were using an office, and there was like, it was a ghost town. There was like hardly anybody there, a few people on workstations. No one was talking to each other, but actually coming together to do this offsite. This was the first time in 2 years they'd done an offsite on team building rather than just on content, on team building. And they go, "Oh, this has been amazing. This is really good." I was skeptical about it. I wasn't sure about it. I didn't really want to come. One of them at the last minute said, "I've got a meeting with the CFO." So I dropped a note to the CFO and I said, "We're having this really important meeting. Can you release him? Because he's got a meeting with you." And he went, "I didn't know he had." In other words, he hadn't. He was just saying he had a meeting, and he sent him on his way. And the guy was a bit bruised and battered, but he then enjoyed the session. But they'd rather avoid it than come together and have this sort of human connection, particularly if they're very technical. So that's on the challenges of relationship building and how important it is. And the second one is the unexpected benefits of human connections during the COVID and even now. I know that people in the back of our screen, and you and I are recording this on video for the first time, Bob, so it's quite fun. But we both got lovely settings in which to have it. But there are occasions when small grandchild, age 3, will come running in going, "Papa, Papa, Papa," and I'll pick him up, and he'll join a conversation that I'm in, or my dog will bark or whatever, or my wife will drop in with a cup of coffee. And so people see that human side of you and they realize that there's more to you than just the person they meet at work. You have this whole other life, that you are a grandfather, a father, whatever it might be. You are an owner of a dog. And that's actually quite healthy. And it allows you to have other conversations. Because the key thing, and just final one before I pass it back to you, time and again, what all teams are saying, we need to build greater levels of mutual trust, more vulnerability, more openness, having real conversations with each other, because trust equals speed times cost in that Covey calculation. What's your thoughts, Bob?
Yeah, no, trust is critical. I mean, clearly, I think, and amusingly, to your point about the setting and people walking into the background and all the rest of it. Back to my judgments point, I think people will make judgments. So if you are doing stuff on video calls and all the rest of it, then be slightly conscious of what your background is. I mean, these days virtual backgrounds are very good, so use them. If that's going to work, there's not really an excuse for saying, "Well, I'm sat in my bedroom, therefore I'm not going to turn around and put myself on camera." And I think if you're not on camera, that in the virtual world is a real problem. I think there are too many people in meetings I see who, for no really good reason, are not on camera. If it's an exception and there's I don't know, you've got poor bandwidth or you're in a bad location to be able to to make it work, or you're traveling or whatever, then fair enough. But by and large, you should aim in today's very connected world to be doing this sort of stuff on camera, because body language is so important. And in terms of building trust and so on, then I think that is really, really key. Because it does help, particularly in that kind of world that we're all now inhabiting. And without that, you're on a hiding to nothing. I think if you haven't got a decent amount of trust in your team, it's back to that. CEOs wanting people into the office because they want to see what they're doing. And I mean, I've heard you talk about it in one of your podcasts previously, where people putting spyware onto company software and so on to check how long you're online for and all the rest of it. I mean, God alive, if you've got to do that, you've got a problem, haven't you? That really is not what you should be needing to do.
No, and you also triggered something in your conversation there on trust and intergenerational, that the greatest need is to bring on that next generation. And yeah, face to face, it works well. You and I love mentoring and coaching, and reverse mentoring is really good, where that younger generation can come in and spend some time with the senior executives or the partners in a consulting firm and give them feedback on how they experience them and their rather outdated views on society and how people should be treated, and whether people forget the names of different women and call them by the wrong name or whatever it might be and insult them. So I think that's interesting. And then the final one, my good friend Oliver Johnson, who I've had on a couple of times, he and I did a program called Stepping Out, which is really helping the senior execs, partners in professional services firms and the like, preparing for leaving the firm and retiring. And that they can do that in a graceful way, and stepping down and planning what's next. So they leave with dignity rather than hanging on to the last safe moment and then leaving and being dead within 2 years because they were working at such a crazy pace and then they suddenly stopped. And stepping it down. I mean, as you say, all that lost knowledge in that partner in Deloitte, isn't there some way that he could somehow bring some of it back for a couple of years with, less time, perhaps 2 days a week or something? But people don't. They're either all in, fully committed, or they're not there at all. And I, like you, here I am, 63. I don't know how long I got left to live, but I really love the work I do. And this is back to the meaning and purpose. If you can find a job where you love what you do, it won't feel like a day's work ever. And how do we get more people to really enjoy what they do? Because a lot of them are not. And that's where the grind comes in. And that's where AI might take out some of the more routine, boring, administrative accounting parts of the business, which need to be automated.
No, I agree. I mean, look back to AI in a second. This is one thing that you prompted a thought with me. I think it's you. I mean, you were in an outer office job in the ministry when you were in the army. I was the recipient of people working in my outer office when I was obviously in my senior roles at the end of my time. I am a huge advocate of the value of that in both directions. I think the senior guy or lady gets huge benefit from having someone who is triaging the work coming into to whatever they're doing, so they can prioritize it, they can make sure it's fit for purpose, they can be to some extent in your mind and prepping stuff and making sure you're shielded a little bit from some of the stuff that's just trivia. Equally, I know the individuals that worked for me, and I don't know, I'd be interested in your thoughts on what you learned from it, gained a huge amount, not from me specifically, hopefully some from me specifically, but an awful lot just from being in the environment. These were up and coming, players in the military, one Air Force, in fact, two Air Force and one Navy, one Army for me in my time. And all of whom were going back at the end of that job back into the mainstream of what they were doing in the service with a much different perspective of the breadth of the business and what we were doing, the level of kind of conversations and engagement that had gone on, and a kind of clarity of some of the things that down at the trenches level, if you like, there are often grumbles about, oh, it's ridiculous. Why do these white warriors do this, this, and this? And of course, they know better. And I think the sad thing for me is in business, very often, not exclusively, but very often, that kind of thing is seen as just a pure overhead. So they don't want to turn around and have people working, additionally in your outer office, triaging what you do and all the rest of it, unless you're super senior. And again, when I look at my time in Deloitte, the very, very senior partners, fine, had chiefs of staff and they had people who were actually working, pulling stuff together in a way that you and I would recognize from that military basis. But only the very senior ones. There are an awful lot of other ones who didn't. And I think that, again, kind of my thought into the leaders world would be you just want to think about that, because you can actually grow people. And particularly when you're looking at retention, you can grow people in a really, really useful, constructive way by thinking about how you actually employ them.
Well, that's touched on a really interesting point. One of my guests, Brigadier Andrew Jackson, salute my job he set up. So helping military people find jobs in business. And I put him together with, or I'm going to, with two of my clients, where I'm seeing time and again when I do the psychometrics and I work with teams at their offsite, they're lacking the role of coordinator, team builder, change manager, planner. So they got lots of people, very ambitious, very highly paid, very driven, making numbers, hitting sales targets, selling business, but they're not working with each other. They're not coordinated well. And when the executive team gets together, they discuss things, but no one's closing the loop and making sure it is done and executed. And they've got lots of open loops. And they get frustrated because they're revisiting topics they've had before. And they're missing what the military know as the chief of staff, that kind of person who has high EQ, who is, as you say, in an outer office kind of scenario, but gets on well with all the senior executives who work for the CEO or the general or air vice marshal, and able to pull them all together taking the egos out of it so that they deliver, they execute and do it. And I see that as a major gap in business, that the military can provide people who can do that for them. But they have to let go of their military jargon, and they have to let go of the sort of the way the military do and learn the business ways of doing it. But the EQ is the bit that's really valuable, and people don't realize how good they are from the military background.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. I think there are employers, I think, who have regularly taken on people from the military for a number of years now and found it very, very successful and gained a lot from it. There are others who are kind of, ooh, not sure, don't really want to dip my toe in that water. And Deloitte have done a lot of work actually on that. And again, tribute to Deloitte. I'm no longer paid by them either, but they really have done some very interesting studies into veterans' work and worked with Forces in Mind and people like that as well to actually produce qualitative assessments about why it's worth employing veterans, and with data behind them in terms of sick days and work ethic and retention and all those kind of things that really do play in. So no, again, something that certainly people should consider, because I think there's a huge amount of value. Let's having gone from employing veterans, let's loop into AI, because I think AI is worth a nod or two here. We've touched a bit about what it's going to bring, and I think nobody's in any doubt that it's going to bring an enormous amount in terms of changes in the workplace. I mean, it's interestingly, I was still am listening to Tony Blair's recent book about leadership, and he talks about this a lot in terms of it is a revolution. It's definitely not an evolution. It's a revolution that's coming, and we need to be kind of embracing it properly, and leaders that don't are going to get left behind for sure. And I think that's right. I do think, though, there's some really interesting challenges for leaders in organizations around expectation management and harnessing the good and mitigating some of the challenge here, because I think there is a real risk and a lot of worry, rightly, in some of the more junior staff in those roles that are potentially a bit more obviously going to be targeted by AI. Well, what's going to happen to me? And I think there's an interesting challenge for governments about how societally they're going to address this, because you could quite easily see a situation here where significant chunks of your workforce are not only now out of a job because they've been replaced by AI, they essentially are unemployable because there are no other jobs that they can really go and do without significantly changing. And some of them can't do that because they don't have the skill base and the academic knowledge and all that sort of thing. And how we generate income for those individuals, as opposed to them just ending up on kind of traditional welfare, is definitely going to be a really big challenge. And I don't think we've got that properly gripped at all yet. I think there's a tsunami coming here, and we haven't really prepared ourselves for it properly.
No, and I've got a number of thoughts from a lot of the guests, and I've been talking about this. So there's quite a few themes that have come up from this, Bob, as I reflect on it. But I think the first thing is, as governments think about this, there's a huge number of people who are out of work and are uninterested in getting back into work. You add to that the big pool of AI of white collar workers, not blue collar. Your electricians and your plumbers, you're going to need those. You're still going to need those. It's actually the guys who are doing the accounting, and they're doing some of the sort of medical work and administrative processing and auditing and stuff like that. A lot of it will be automated. So you've got replacement versus augmentation, and they reckon that by 2027, we're only talking about a couple of years away, not even 2030, machines may surpass almost every cognitive task. We'll get the singularity, as they call it, where the machines are cleverer than us. And then they're going to start looking at us and going, there's a bit of a problem here. There's too many humans. Let's get rid of some of these humans. So
it's the Terminator scenario, isn't it?
Well, we laugh about it, but actually it's going to really think about it carefully. So if the government is worried about people out of work, they haven't seen the half of it yet, because there's going to be a huge amount of people who, if they don't reskill as quickly as possible, are unemployable. and they don't have a mindset to adapt and change. Like, this is what I do. I was a person who did weaving and sewing, and I can't, or I was good on a typewriter. Well, that's no longer needed. And so adapting people's.
Research, I think, is an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, in the law, for example, where a lot of those cut their teeth early on doing a lot of research work, and Parliament is another one. Where you've got youngsters going into that world where they're spending a lot of time in the kind of building background, providing background briefs to people, feeding the beast, as it were, above them, and that's how they grow their experience. And of course, suddenly that layer is going to get cut out. I mean, interestingly, to my background, airlines. I mean, I gather just from listening to a different podcast recently that EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, has just shelved the drive that Airbus has been pushing on this to turn around and potentially look at single pilot operations of airliners, on the basis that technology is good enough to allow you to do that. And obviously there's one step beyond that into no pilot airliners. But the challenge, certainly in that initial step, and maybe less so for the second step, is that you become a captain in an airliner now by spending years in the other seat in the airplane, growing that experience. So you don't suddenly get matrix like a chip implanted in your head that says, okay, you can now fly an airliner and you've got thousands of hours of experience. You have to build that. So how you replace that in a world where actually we're saying, well, a lot of that more mundane stuff can be done by the machine, is going to be a challenge. And I think you're right. I mean, ultimately the machine will be saying, well, actually we can do the advanced stuff and you can do the more mundane stuff. It might actually be the way it ultimately plays out. It'd be interesting to see. I think the one thing that I'm sure of is I don't think senior leaders in particular are necessarily spending enough time thinking about this, thinking about what impact it's going to have on their business, what impact it's going to have on all the subordinate and or related businesses that they work with, and how that interaction is going to take place, because that is definitely a revolution. And it's not something, if you're in the kind of I've got 10 years left in my career, why do I need to worry about that? I think you still need to worry about it, just because you need to be responsible as a leader to lead your people. You can't just turn around and say, well, that's your problem, guys, you're going to have to pick that up. You need to be paying attention to where this capability is taking you. And if you're not using some of the tools now, you need to start. You need to get in there and get an understanding of what it kind of offers, and how you can employ it, and what sort of capability is there, because it's amazing. I mean, some of the stuff is truly amazing.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, just take even a small section like the transformation of education. Why are you learning these things at school? Because the large language models can tell you this information. Why do you have to learn it? And if you look at the traditional university model, it's highly questionable, and it's in deep, deep trouble with corporations waking up to what should education actually look like, and is a degree needed anymore? With micro training and non-degree options and skills that are relevant. How are you going to work alongside AI to just manage it and supervise it? But actually, much of the information, the old way of learning, rote learning of lots of stuff, why are you doing that? Because you can just press a button and ask the question and it gives you better. And all the, now that the Watson model can give better diagnosis than a GP can, because it's got every kind of option of illness that you have, and you just type in what Bob Judson has when he comes and sees them, and you have a lot of them to choose from, but you can come up with that, and it recommends what medicine you should have. And it also has your history going back since birth, which is available there. And so I think everything is up for grabs at the moment, and people just don't realize that. They go, oh yeah, it doesn't affect my area, it might affect other areas, but no, everything is being affected. You're right, it's a revolution.
No, I totally agree. And on that education point, I think the other aspect of that is the world of education has an absolute duty to be trying to turn this a little bit, to prepare people better for getting into the world of work. And I don't think they are. I think they are, in large part, and I'm sure that we'll probably get shot by a couple of people who listen to this who are educationalists who will say, well, no, it's not the case. But the reality is in large part, we are still pressing ahead with the traditional kind of these are the subjects you do, these are the exams you do, this is the way you do those exams, and this is a bar, and it's proving your kind of academic potential and your ability to learn and all the rest of it. And I'm not decrying the need to demonstrate some of that. I am questioning seriously whether or not the techniques used for that, to your point, are the right ones, and also what are you actually teaching them. I mean, a good example, maybe silly example, but map reading, used to be a thing, right? It was really, really important to turn around and be able to read a map if you were going to do any job, even drive a car, those sorts of things. Road atlas. I mean, who has a road atlas now? Nobody, because everybody uses one of these. Everybody's got a smartphone that they're pulling out, and they're navigating on that, and that is driving their entire life, to the extent that they drive stupidly into silly places because that's where the sat nav takes them. That will obviously get better, but we are completely replacing some of these traditional skills that we've had for years and relied on for years with what is the question, because I think we need to think about what is it that we then need to be doing, and how are we going to approach this. And I don't have the answers to all of those questions by any means, but what I do know is we need to be paying a lot more attention. I was amazed recently, just playing with ChatGPT, not just for written stuff, but actually for images, what it can actually do and the transformation it can affect, and how it produces stuff, and in an incredibly short space of time. And so not only is it a big time saver, but it's just the versatility and capability of really what's still quite a basic AI system, and it is obviously going to get an awful lot better.
Yeah, I mean, every month it improves, and I use Perplexity, and it continues to amaze me how clever it can adapt people's style and language. I've just written my third book, which is rather relevant to what we're talking about. It's called The CEO's Compass: How to Navigate Teams Through Turbulent Times. And you're in it, Bob.
Yeah.
You're in it with a quote, and sharing your wisdom, experience. But it is all about this topic, and it comes back to the power of purpose. In a world where skills can be automated, the sense of meaning, the why, is going to be your greatest asset. If you can understand your why as an anchor to motivate people, and they have a sense of a vocation, not just a job, because your job's going to change. But if you've got a calling and a vocation, you will adapt to whatever tools are given to you. And I think that is what will lead to more happiness, because people are focusing on success. One of these guys, the young 30-year-old's son of, was saying, I want to make a lot of money. I said, well, why do you want to make a lot of money? I mean, is it to pay the mortgage? I mean, what's behind that? What is your calling? What is going to be with you, whatever happens to the way the world and AI changes? And so this is, I think, going to be a key one. And for those who don't find their sense of meaning and purpose, that's where the mental health and well-being and the uncertainty is going to make them anxious and stressed. And we've got already massive amounts of mental health issues, anxiety, people off permanently sick for years. That's going to be creating even more problems for them, don't you think?
Yeah, totally. So I mean, the more stressful it becomes and worrisome it becomes, then the more that exacerbates an already big problem. And I think, I mean, on the positive side of that, I think people are, on mental health specifically, I think people are so much more open about it than they used to be. There's so much less stigma around it than there used to be. That's a really good thing. And the fact we've got better kind of approaches to dealing with it, and lots of people are handling that very differently. Again, all really positive. But we are, if we're not careful, we're going to turn ourselves inside out with an even bigger problem, because we've just created so much more uncertainty and difficulty for them. And talking of bigger problems, the other topic that I think we're going to talk about, which we need to because of time, is twin track, really. Populism, extreme forms of government, geopolitical instability. The world feels to me to be in a very, very different place. I mean, I cut my teeth in the Cold War, at the back end of the Cold War, when we had a clear threat from the Soviet Union. We honored that threat. We had a very good kind of defensive capability and a response capability to what we perceived as a threat at a time. We took a huge peace dividend, quite understandably, over the last multiple decades to say, right, okay, we're fine. Big alliances have really helped to keep that peace. But now all of that feels much more threatened. And I think for leaders in any walk of life, particularly public sector ones in this space, maybe, but also then actually industry as well, there are some really interesting challenges because as you move to more populism, more extreme forms of government, and as some of it is quite weird. I mean, in the UK here, the Reform Party, which is a very new political party, quite right wing. Some would argue very right wing. It would have been unthinkable even a couple of years ago to suggest that the Reform Party would get anywhere in terms of forming a government. Whereas actually, come the next election in 2028 in the UK, it is not at all unthinkable. That 2029, I think, is our next election. It is quite probable that they will be not only getting a lot of seats, but they could even win the election on current trajectories, and that is challenging an awful lot of people in a way that I don't think we've seen for decades. Obviously, you've got Donald Trump in the White House for the second time, with a lot of turbulence being created around that, with not only within America but also well and truly outside it, and not least the fact that the reliability of some of those traditional alliances has been shaken to the core. NATO being a classic example of that. So I think it all feels very threatening. I think for youngsters, now that must feel they're either kind of going, whoa, don't want to pay any attention, I'm just going to keep the blinkers on, or they are definitely worried, and they should be worried. And that's before you add in climate and the inevitability of changes that are coming from climate change around the world, migration flows and water shortages and so on and so forth, which are undoubtedly going to induce more challenge. But again, is this a topic that's cropping up with some of the CEOs you're talking to?
Yeah, they're all very focused on navigating teams through turbulent times and geopolitical threats. The fact that everything that we thought was the rules-based order has gone. Trump has been revolutionary in the way he's just turned everything on its head, and no one can rely on the safety of the dollar. You've seen that the dollar slide a bit in its value. American institutions, anything that was set up after the Second World War has pretty much lost its credence and lost its backing by America and all the other allies. And so what it does for many of the business leaders is they go, I think I'll just hang on. I won't commit to this or that because I'm not sure which way the tariffs are going to go. Like one of my companies who I work with in Seattle, they get their machinery, their big diggers from the UK, which go to America then to be, sold or leased out, or from Japan, and supply chains and China, and where do you, one of my other suppliers here in Lincolnshire, they get their products produced in China and then Thailand and other countries. So they're all affected by, does China invade Taiwan? It's a question of not if China will invade Taiwan, but when. And people I know who live and work in Taiwan have said to me in the last 6 months that we expect about 2026, 27, they'll just walk in. Is Trump going to stop that happening? I don't think he's that interested in doing much about it any more than he is in giving any more equipment to Ukraine. I think he wants Russia to win. It's the strangest of things to find a US president who's big buddies and constantly on the phone to his mate Vladimir. And, how long has he been the Manchurian candidate? I don't know. But it's just a world where you woke up and you went, hang on, am I dreaming this? Or is this really going on?
You could make movies, couldn't you? Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is surreal, some of that. I mean, I guess my concern for both of us living in the UK here is the UK end of this, because I think there is a real issue with the UK population at large still being slightly myopic about it, not feeling there is no existential threat. It's Ukraine's quite a long way away. Israel and Gaza is certainly quite a long way away. What's going on in America? Well, yeah, it's not that big a deal. Slightly annoying, but it is what it is. And we got Brexit, so that's all fine. You kind of go, what? And we've just had a national security strategy out. We've got a national strategic defense review out. Both of which, and you can see the mood music, even in the media, the mood music is, oh, we need to spending more money on defense. And the Prime Minister, I was listening to him yesterday saying, it's still my number one priority is security of the nation. Well, okay, fine. You've got to put your money where your mouth is somewhere here. And I don't see that. I mean, you see all this saga that's just gone on in the past week that we're recording this around welfare reforms, where they've ultimately had to walk back from an awful lot of that. That's going to cost the government a lot of money that they don't have. So it's their ability to turn around and actually make real differences. And at the same time, individuals on the street, cost of living in this country and around the world, I think has changed dramatically. And so I do worry we are sort of sleepwalking not only into an AI revolution that we were talking about a minute ago, but into a really potentially turbulent, conflict kind of ridden time, which has really significant implications. I mean, obviously, and I was mentioning to you off air. I mean, those at Sky News, I credit them for it. They did a thing called the War Game, which is a five episode podcast. And I'm not trying to drag people away from our podcasts, but that is one that is worth listening to because it does give a very, very interesting perspective on a kind of putative Russian attack on the UK and the way that that might play out with uncertainty around allies and so on and so forth. And the very comfortable way of life that most people have grown up with, even if they're not physically comfortable in terms of lots of finance and all the rest of it, they've got reasonable certainty of electricity supply, that their mobile phone signal is going to stay constant, that they'll be able to get connected to the internet, that the supermarkets are going to have stock by and large most of the time. All those kind of things are in play where actually all of them are very vulnerable. And when you look in the business context at the amount of private sector industries that are interlinked internationally with all sorts of dependencies that I think are definitely vulnerable. Governments who've turned around and said, yeah, actually, do you know what? It doesn't matter if we sell off part of the electricity grid to foreign nationals, or if we sell off the telephone infrastructure, or if we privatize all these other things that are critical national infrastructure. And I just think there's an interesting debate brewing here that, again, back to my comment about AI, I'm not sure that I've got many of the answers, but I think that one of the things I do know is that leaders need to be thinking about this, and they need to be taking a stance on whatever their stance is. They need to be, I'm not saying they need to be saying the same thing I'm saying, but they need to be thinking about what is our position, what is my position, how am I going to articulate that to the people that work for me, and how am I going to make our views as an organization felt in the debate that is undoubtedly coming.
Yeah. And the other thing, in addition to what you just said, Bob, that the leaders are concerned about, some of them have experienced cyber warfare. Mm-hmm. They've actually, I mean, I had Archie Norman on, the chairman of Marks and Spencer's. You saw the terrible cyber attack they had. Two of my other clients, as CEOs, have had to deal with catastrophic cyber attacks where they've, locked down basically, unless you pay this money, we're gonna not release the key that you need to use your computers again. So that is a problem for them, and the fact that the main state actors of China, North Korea, and Russia are all constantly attacking the banks that I work with every day. They're having multiple attacks against them every day, and economic pressures and technical disruptions are causing big concerns for them. So I think the headwinds for people running businesses these days are, it's almost like a perfect storm for them going on at the moment. There's always been problems, but I think they have a particular concern about what's going on in a world which is no longer having an order that's stable, or everybody's agreed how we're going to work with each other.
Yeah, no, I totally. And again, it's just one of those things, again, for the purposes of what we were trying to do with this podcast, I think is just generate some thoughts, for people. And the risk for lots of people, lots of the time, is they're caught up in their own little world with a very busy life, with thousands of emails arriving, lots of other stuff going on, and next crisis just around the corner. Actually, carving out some time for yourself to be able to go and think bigger thoughts, make sure you're delegating stuff down so you've actually got that time, and empowering people to do stuff, all the kind of traditional leadership things that we'll probably often talk about. But actually, this kind of stuff is really important.
Yeah, and actually, I was reflecting on this in the conversations with guests. I've been saying to them, so what can leaders do to mitigate these concerns? They came up with a number. The first one is lean into the humanity, the human part of it. People are hurting; they want to feel connected. The second one is psychological safety. A lot of places don't feel very safe. And I think some of these businesses are places of fear, a bit like, if you're working for Trump or in his administration, there's very little courage. People are not standing out. Only 2 people stood up against his big, beautiful bill because everybody else is too scared to stand up to him. They feel intimidated. Whether it's guests like David Petraeus or others, Admiral Bill McRaven, spoke out. But, Trump then said, I'm going to call him back and I'm going to, lock him up. What? So he takes action against people who stand up to him against. One of the things in psychological safety, 10 words, 3 phrases, which good leaders find that if they use it, it really helps psychological safety. The first phrase is, I was wrong. The second is, I don't know. And the third is, I need some help. And very few leaders, you wouldn't hear Trump use any of those words, but really good leaders use those terms. And that's why having these offsites is so good. And the other one of the leaders, Oz Alashi, who runs a cybersecurity business, and he was a lieutenant colonel in Special Forces, he said, what I can't give them is certainty. People want certainty. I can't give them certainty. But what I can give them is I can give them clarity. So the vision, the mission, the purpose, what we're about, and the fact that, guys, things are going to be very flexible, moving quickly, very changing, but this is our strategy, and we will adapt to what goes on depending on what comes to us. But what we stand for and why we do what we do. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, totally. So I think that level of engagement is really important, and a sense of, we care about you, and we're engaged with you. I think, again, some companies are very good at that in terms of their communications and messaging down very personally from senior partners or chief executives or whatever it happens to be in organizations. I think that what I've seen is they can be a lot better than they used to be. There are some that are still kind of in the doldrums, really. I think the bit that probably I worry about more is not the top level of the organization. It's the middle, the sort of the layer down from that, and the middle management almost, where I think they need to be, because they are leaders. I think quite often there are too many people who look upwards and go, yeah, but it's the leadership's issue. The reality is, there's an awful lot of leadership levels in any organization, and those leaders need to recognize they are leaders, and they have an absolute role in raising stuff up where it's appropriate to raise it up, but also pushing stuff back down and being part of that kind of settling the debate. And as you say, certainty is not something that's going to be a commodity easy to come by in near term, and maybe even medium term. So I think the navigating through that and finding a way through that in any level as a leader is important, and not just turning around and parroting what's been said above, or without challenging it at least. I mean, I'm not advocating that there should be constant dissent with the leadership. I don't think that's helpful either. I always used to argue that in most of my roles that we'll have a really robust debate in the senior leadership team, but then at the end of the day, I think I joked with you on when I did the podcast with you last time, we're here to preserve democracy, not to practice it. And so once we've actually had the conversation, then ultimately we'll reach a decision, hopefully consensus decision. If not, then ultimately I'm the leader. I'll turn around and say, this is what we're going to do. And I expect at that point that, the team working for me is going to turn around and go down that track. And, cabinet responsibility, if you like, same approach. But I think that doesn't often happen in lots of organizations now. I think there's a lot of, consent and evade, and or active, negative speaking. One of the things when I was doing crisis management at Deloitte, we used to argue a lot about with companies. Look, you need to look at your stakeholder groups. If you're having an event, you talked about cyber attacks. So if you're having a cyber attack, then you have a whole bunch of stakeholders. You need to turn around and start engaging in this. I mean, some of those are obvious, customers, shareholders, clients, board, politicians, regulators, all sorts, those sorts of external big factor stakeholders that the traditional leader is going to look upwards and outwards. Internally, these are big stakeholders for you. Managing that well is really important, because if you get it wrong, then the internal stakeholders can suddenly, instead of being real advocates for you in terms of pushing the right messages and help to solve the solution, can become quite big detractors because they don't know. Mushroom syndrome, they're living in the dark and they're fed on crap. They need to know, and they need to feel that actually the firm in that point cares about them, is investing in what they're thinking and doing, and all the rest of it. And I think that's, again, something that leadership need to be very, very aware of at all levels of the organization. It's not good enough just to turn around and talk the talk in this. You have to be in that space. I mean, a silly but relevant example is if you're having some kind of social event and you're leading the organization, or you're at some kind of team building event, then if you're a leader of any level in the organization, turn up, be there. Even if you're there for a shortish period of time, be there for a chunk of that time. Too many times it's, well, I paid for the bill, I paid the bill for the food and the booze, and they can all go and have a good time. That's fine. No, they want to see you there. They want to talk to you. They want to know, to your point earlier on, about your humanity. Learn a bit more about you, and it's really, really important. And again, I don't think that necessarily happens enough.
No, I agree. How are we doing for time, Bob?
I think we're pretty much at time, and
I think
we should wrap this. And I mean, when we started out, I think the aim was to talk around a few problems, and I think we've done that. And we won't have solved them by any means, but I'm hoping what we've done is shed some light and thrown a few tips along the way, and some things people should think about. And if nothing else, I hope we've given some people food for thought on some of these areas that are clearly quite common ground. We're seeing it a lot with the different people we're talking to and working with. That means that obviously those problems exist more widely, and hopefully that's useful to people.
Thoroughly agree, Bob. Thank you very much indeed. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, perfect. Brilliant. Great to talk to you again, Jonathan. Thanks very much.
Not at all.
I really hope you've enjoyed this interview with Jonathan and our discussion about lots of different challenges that all sorts of leaders are facing at the moment. If you did enjoy it, then please like it, share it, push it around your friends, share it widely on social media so we get more listeners to pay attention to some of these things, because I think it is an important conversation that we contribute to, but that others can keep on going. If you find this really valuable, then, as I've said many times, please consider giving me some value back for that value and supporting the show financially. You can do that by going to the Support the Show link in your podcast platform, and that will take you to my Patreon site. You can also go directly there by going to www.patreon.com/leadingforlife, and you'll find the option to become a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show. And any one of those will be really, really valuable to me. It doesn't cost you very much. It's pretty much less than the cost of a cup of coffee from your average high street brand at the low end of the subscriptions. And you'll be making a massive difference. So if you're up for that, I would be really, really grateful. I'll be back very soon with the next episode and installment of the show. But until then, have a great week. Thanks very much indeed for listening. All the very best. Bye now.